Rod. So kia ora koutou. Before we start, let's have a karakia from Bevan. Is Bevan here? Hope he's here, isn't he?
Kia ora, I'm here. Ngā mihi nui ki a tātou, I runga I te pāka whakaata reo nei, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko tāku mai I nai, he karakia. He honore, he kororia ki te atua, he mai ngā rongo ki te mata o te whenua, he whakaaro pai ki ngā tāngata katoa, hanga e te atua, he ngā kauhau, ki roto ki tēnā o mātou, whakatongia tō wairua tapu, hei awhina, hei tohu I a mātou, kororia ki tō ingoa tapu, ake, āmini.
Āmini. Kia ora. Thank you, Bevan.
Kia ora.
Bevan's one of the team members from here at the Commission. So welcome everyone to the Climate Change Commission's first ever webinar. My name's Harriet Palmer. I'm the Principal Advisor on the Communications and Engagement team. This is the first of a few of these that we're going to be holding over the next few months to introduce ourselves and the work that we've been putting into creating our very first package of advice to the government on the actions Aotearoa must take to meet our climate goals. A package will be out for consultation on the 1st of February, so mark that in your diaries. But before then, we're really keen to start sharing some of our work that's going into forming our advice. It's going to be a lot to get through, and we want to make sure that when everyone arrives at the 1st of February, you have a good grounding in what we do and how we're going to arrive at that. So there's heaps of you here today, which is really heartening to see. We're feeling a lot of support from across our motu. And I'm going to throw over to Rod shortly, but before that, just a little bit of housekeeping. So 2, possibly 3 topics will be covered today. There's going to be a section after each for questions. We have some that people have sent ahead, so thank you so much for those. Otherwise, there's a Q&A button down the bottom that you can use. So pop the questions in there. Keep them really brief and concise. That will make it easier for us to read them and get through them and Rod to answer them. And also, I think it's good for us to recognise that there's a really diverse group here. We've opened this up to the public, which is the first time many people from the public have heard from us. I know a lot of you are stakeholders who we've been talking to frequently. So just maybe think about who'll be listening and what would be nice for them to know. You can also use the chat to talk amongst yourselves or share information. We found afterwards often that's a really rich source of information for us. And I think that's about all. Oh, we're going to do some polls. We've got a few questions that will pop up and you can answer those, and the answers will come up as we go along. Sorry, I just interrupted. Okay, so I'm going to, just before I throw to Rod, we're going to try that chat. Can you all put your name and the organisation that you bring with you in there? And the chat will go out to all participants afterwards, as well as copies of the questions that we get and the answers. Some of them might be technical, but we'll go for it. Look, here we go. Oh, very cool. Okay, and the next thing I'm going to ask people to do after you've done that, these might take a little while, is put one word that you would like to use to describe your hope, or it might be preempting it, but one word that you would like to see summarise your hope for climate action in Aotearoa from here. Urgent action. Abundant, systemic. Transformational. EVs. This is really wonderful. Thank you. After this, we're going to collate all these words and we'll share them as well. Okay, so now to introduce you to Rod Carr. Rod joined the Commission as our chair in December when we formed. He's a former Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Canterbury University and former Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank. He's also a committed Cantabrian, beaming in from Christchurch, and his 4 children have told him that this is the job he needs to take if he wants to make a difference. Over to you, Rod.
Kia ora, everybody. Ena mana, ena iwi, tēnā koutou katoa. It is a privilege and also a pleasure to take this opportunity to talk to you and hear from you in the hour that lies ahead. Some of you will know much of what you might hear today. Some of you may hear new things. The important thing is that you're all hearing it at the same time. I would like to take this opportunity to state once again the vision that the Climate Change Commission has of a thriving, climate resilient, low emissions Aotearoa. These are but three of many pillars that will make for a sustainable, inclusive society. But in the view of the Commission, that is the vision of the part that we need to play in giving our advice to government. I'll talk a little more about the nature of that advice shortly. The Commission's Maori name, Hei Po Arangi, recognises that we are but one of many pillars that support Rangi the Sky Father, that many of you constitute other pillars in this important work. And I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge and thank many of those who I know are in this audience for the part they have played not only in the last year in advising or contributing to the work of the Commission, but in some cases for their working lifetime in advocating for climate action. I was late to this party, and I have to admit in the last 12 months, I have occasionally felt like I have been trying to drink from a fire hose. There is an enormous amount of evidence, an enormous amount of passion, and increasingly a willingness to take action to decarbonise, and also more broadly to reduce the impact that we have as humans on our planet and our inhabitable world. I would like to also acknowledge the learning I have, which is the top of most pyramids of action. We have something in common. My investigations and growing understanding of our waste hierarchy puts at the top of that the need to reduce and then reuse. At the top of our energy hierarchy must stand energy efficiency. Use wisely and carefully all forms of energy. They all have a footprint somewhere. And for active mobility, get on your feet or on a bike as best you can when you can. That it is the case that the best way to reduce greenhouse gases is to reduce some aspects of how we use our natural resources. The work of the Climate Change Commission is, however, not all things climate change or all things climate action. Central government, local government, businesses, households, and individuals all have their part to play. No action is too small, but institutional arrangements and systemic change are needed in order to support the actions of individuals. Let me talk a little about the near-term work that the Commission has a statutory obligation to perform. We are responsible for providing advice to the government of the day on New Zealand's emission budgets, budgets that would be consistent with our statutory target for 2050 to reduce methane emissions by 24 to 47% and to be net zero in all other gases. And not only to provide budgets which are consistent with our domestic targets, but budgets that are consistent with our international obligations, our nationally determined contribution under the Paris Climate Change Agreement. But designing budgets that would be consistent with those pathways is itself not enough. If, in identifying that we are not on that path but need to get onto it, then we need plans about how to close the gap. And the Commission is responsible for providing advice on emissions reduction plan. the plan that will put us on that pathway. Minister Shaw has also asked us, at the same time as we provide that advice, to advise on whether our nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement is consistent with our plans and budgets and our obligations under the Paris Agreement. And interestingly, to opine on whether our biogenic methane target is also consistent with our obligations. Many of you will know the rich detail of how and when baselines are defined, the difference between gross emissions and net emissions, the different ways in which the warming effect of gases can be measured. I'm not going to dive into that level of detail today. But on the 1st of February, that's not far away, the draft advice of the Commission around our first emissions budgets out to 2035 and the emission reduction plan that is necessary to put us on that pathway will be made available for public consultation. As Harriet has already said, put a note in your diary that some days or weeks might be occupied early next year in thinking about what our advice is saying or not saying, and providing a contribution that would inform the finalisation of our advice by the 31st of May. The government will then have 20 working days to consider that advice before it must make it public. And it will have until the 31st of December next year to determine for all New Zealanders what our emissions budgets will be and what our emissions reduction plan will be. So by the end of 2021, we will for the first time have certainty about how we will achieve the targets which we have already set in statute and agreed to in our international treaty obligations. The clock is ticking. It is clear that action is going to be required. The other point to make is that the Climate Change Commission is a long-lived, hopefully perpetual institution. That we're not a task force presenting a report and then moving on. The board of the Commission and the staff of the Commission have a long-term commitment. A commitment to continuously improve the data that is the evidence base, to improve our understanding of effective policy action, to monitor progress against agreed budgets and plans. You will help us do our job better every day of every week as we progress into the future. We won't get it all right the first time. We acknowledge that and are open to your advice and support as we move to provide our advice to the government. One of the interesting questions is, should New Zealand be a leader, a fast follower, or a laggard in the international quest to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? All G7 countries have now signed up to be net zero all gases. China by 2060, the others by 2050. Our target is not quite that. Should it be? Harriet, over to you for your poll.
Okay, so we've got a little poll that we're popping up, and we've now got about 5 minutes for questions. While you're doing that, Rod, I'll ask you a couple of questions that we've had sent in beforehand. One here that has come from Martin Fryer. Minister Shaw stated at the Climate Change and Business Conference last week, the first carbon budget will be shocking. Is this due to the necessarily aggressive approach to emissions reductions over the next 10 years so that New Zealand aligns with the 1.5 degrees trajectory?
I can't speak for the minister as to what he might have had in mind. He clearly was also careful to say that he had not seen the work of the Commission, and that's appropriate. He will see it, as he said, on the 1st of February. We'll probably give his office a little 24-hour heads up. But clearly, New Zealand is not on a pathway today that would be consistent with our nationally determined contribution. The nationally determined contribution is that New Zealand's net emissions of greenhouse gases measured in CO2 equivalent terms on the global warming effect over 100 years would see us emit 601 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents between now and 2030. Clearly, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to know that we are currently not on that path. How much we are short or will be short will depend on the forecasts, and I'll talk a little about that later.
Thank you, Rod. Here's another question that was sent in from an anonymous source. How should we direct our investments now to get the biggest impact in 20 years?
The Climate Change wrote to Minister Shaw in April with 6 principles for government spending and investment. And I believe those spending and investment principles would apply in the private sector as well. Very quickly, the first one was all spending and investment decisions should be made looking through a climate change lens. That the climate is changing, the world will need to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions dramatically and quickly, and all our spending and investment decisions should be looked at through that lens. Secondly, bring forward investments that you're going to have to make towards the end of the decade and get on and do them sooner. Thirdly, act in partnership. No one alone, no institution, no sovereign nation, no individual, no household alone can resolve this matter. Find partners, leverage your relationships. The banking, finance, insurance sector can play its part by making sure it deploys our capital through a climate change lens. Other principles included the fact that price must be allowed to play its part, but that price alone cannot do all the work that needs to be done. A further principle is that we need the training and skills for the jobs that need to be done in the middle of the 21st century. And we need to make sure that we train for that world, not the world of yesterday. And finally, we made the point that we need to think carefully about what we measure, that our fixation on measuring GDP, a measure of monetized busyness in our lives, misses a lot about the things we value and the essential conditions for sustainable future well-being.
Thank you, Rod. Thank you everyone else for your other questions. I'm going to move on to our next section now, but keep putting them in there and we'll come to them in our next question session. And we've also got a later session, which is a little bit longer. So Rod, over to you now to have a discussion about some of our scenarios work.
So obviously from the point of view of the Commission, we had to decide how we were going to go about the task of preparing budgets and an emission reduction plan. First, we needed to establish what was the circumstance today. Where are we now? What are our emissions? And what path are we on, given established policies? Some of those policies have been around for a while. Some of them are new policies that have yet to take effect or have the effect that we expect they might have. The newly reformed emissions trading scheme is one such new instrument, and water reforms that will change the way in which nitrogen is spread on the land will change land use and the emissions associated with that land use. So we've built a reference case. The reference case is based on the best available and up-to-date information, but inevitably includes some assumptions about how things will pan out in the absence of further policy action. We then look at worlds that are different from the reference case that put us on a pathway to meet our domestic targets and fulfill our international obligations. And we think about the two great levers that are going to play out over the coming decade. One of those levers is technology. What kind of technologies are emerging, and how quickly will they be adapted for New Zealand's context and adopted by New Zealanders? That technology path may be one that is a little faster or a little slower. And the second great dimension is our behaviours, what we choose, and I mean the collective we as citizens and civil society allow our politicians to do for us, require our businesses to do on our behalf, or as households choose to do. And the constraints on behaviour change are not just our own willingness to act. The constraints on behaviour change can be institutional arrangements or the systems in which we operate. And we in the Commission think of that as being a set of circumstances where behaviours can change or are allowed to change or enabled to change reasonably quickly, or where behaviour change is slower. So you end up with a 2x2 matrix and 4 possible scenarios. One scenario, which we've termed our tailwind scenario, is where technology breaks in our favour a little faster and behaviours change a little sooner and to a greater extent than in other scenarios. The tailwind scenario obviously enables us to meet and to some extent potentially exceed our domestic targets and meet or exceed our international obligations. The headwind scenario sees technology slower to be adopted, slower to emerge, and behaviour change somewhat slower than in the other scenarios. In those circumstances, more, bolder policy action is necessary for us to be on a pathway consistent with our domestic targets and international obligations. So the scenarios to some extent show pathways and policy choices and allow a government on our behalf to make a range of choices and trade-offs. The scenarios do show that there are pathways to 2050 consistent with our domestic targets and existing nationally determined contribution, remembering that the nationally determined contribution under Paris can be met through domestic action and international mitigation. We will meet our nationally determined contribution. The only open question is what proportion will we meet through domestic action and what proportion will we meet through international mitigation. The scenarios are rich with assumptions and judgments. We will be as transparent as we can to allow you to figure out where you think we are and where you think we should be going. I believe you have another poll, Harry.
Yes, we've got another poll coming here. Here we go. So this is asked you whether you think we'll be likely to be in a headwinds or a tailwinds scenario. Hopefully you all gathered where we're at with that. I just want to let you know that thank you so much for all your questions. What we're doing is we're some of them we're pulling over and we will respond in writing. So some just to keep us on track and to make sure that we're using our time wisely. So don't worry, we will be responding to you if we don't do it right now. So thank you so much for all of them. And everyone will see the answers to those questions, so we'll share that. Rod, so we've got a question coming from Yuki. Hi, Yuki. And this is something that's come up a few times, so I think it might be a good opportunity for us to talk about it, particularly following the article and stuff by Eloise around behaviour change. So Yuki asks, effective public campaigns on reducing emissions, TV, internet posters, for example, are needed to facilitate behaviour changes. What will the Climate Change Commission be recommending this to government?
Yeah, so I enjoyed the interview with Eloise, and I believe she faithfully represented the conversation we have had. So those of you who haven't seen that write-up should. I know the active mobility cycle action people were a little concerned that maybe the way that interview was represented overemphasized the need simply to educate people and they would make choices. The point was made, and I agree, that we need arrangements in our cities and communities that enable, support, and keep safe our cyclists. That it's not just a matter of education. It is, however, a matter of changing the behaviours of our wider community about their willingness to take on and accept a responsibility to allow our roadways and cycleways to be configured to support decarbonising transport. So that was an example of a broader construct, is that no one in Wellington holds either the mandate, i.e. the task, or the budget to advocate and inform the public about necessary climate action if we are going to take responsibility for our emissions and reduction. And I still believe that there needs to be such a mandate and such resources. But there are experts in how human behaviours can be changed, and it is incredibly important that we build on that knowledge and understanding so that we can create a context in which political leaders, business leaders, and we as consumers change to make good choices that support the reduction of our greenhouse gas emissions from today.
Thank you. Has anyone got anything they wanted to ask following that? I know that Alex from Cycle Wellington sent in a question asking about whether we'll advocate will we listen to public health experts for ways we can effectively lower car use and dependency and recommend effective evidence-based interventions accompanied by good communications like we have witnessed with the COVID-19 crisis? There's another question here which is also similar to, where is it? Sorry, there are questions in the chat and questions in the Q&A, and so I'm struggling to, here we go. So Francis says, like with COVID, we could have the technology, ICU beds, but not the technical resources, ICU nurses, which take quite some time to train and need to be started now. Is the Commission preparing for that?
Well, again, I'd come back to the Commission is not responsible for doing the actions. The actions need to be done by the appropriate institutions, whether they're government agencies, local bodies, or households or individuals. The actors in this are us, are New Zealanders. The Commission's work is to provide advice, and that advice is about the direction of policy. So the Commission isn't going to be writing black letter regulation to ban this, prohibit that, or subsidise this or that thing to this or that extent. Our advice on the direction of policy is going to be higher level than many would like, but we will give examples of the kind of policy that needs to be enacted to be effective. So the tightrope the Commission needs to walk is not to claim to have the detailed knowledge that the Ministry of Transport might have, or the Ministry for the Environment might have, or even that some actors in the business community might have about their businesses and how to reduce their emissions. What we need to do is make sure that our emissions reduction plan provides advice to the government of the day on some of the policies that need to be adopted in order to support the transmission to a climate resilient, low emissions Aotearoa.
Thank you, Rod. And another question from an anonymous attendee. How does the speed of action being taken by other countries get factored into the scenarios and therefore the implications for the international competitiveness of our exporters?
Yeah, these are very good questions, and they go to the heart of New Zealand does need to pay its way in the world, but increasingly the world will expect us to pay our way, not only by earning foreign exchange, but by making our fair share of a contribution to a global problem of greenhouse gas emissions. The question of what constitutes New Zealand's fair share in the eyes of the world, as well as in the eyes of New Zealanders, is an inherently a matter of judgment, not scientific fact. It has occasionally been pointed out that New Zealand's share of global emissions is quite small. That is true. But so are the emissions of 30 or 40 small nation states. And even large countries like China and India emit in the order of 15 to 20% of total global emissions. It matters a lot what they do, but it also matters a lot what we do. Under the Paris Agreement, there is an assumption that the wealthier countries will do a slightly larger share of the heavy lifting, that the countries who have benefited most from past emissions will contribute more than might be just their per capita share. So in New Zealand's case, to remain globally competitive is no longer just a question of being a low-cost provider. It is also being a provider with a low emissions footprint. So a couple of data points. Per capita, New Zealand emits about 16 tonnes gross greenhouse gas equivalent CO2 emissions, 16 tonnes. India and China per capita are 1/4 of that, 4 tonnes. So we can certainly look at China and say they contribute a large share of total emissions. But on a per capita basis, we are up there with among the highest emitters in the world.
Thank you, Rod. While we're on the international theme, we've got another question here from Sophia. She asks, you mentioned international mitigation as a way of meeting our international targets. How do you see this playing up in the future versus domestic action? And what type of international mitigations should we be expecting the government to take, e.g. Kyoto units?
So the first thing is the Minister and the Climate Change Commission and the Act indicate that we are to do as much as we can from our domestic action. In other words, this is not a case of buying our way into a high emitting future. So domestic action means how much New Zealand is prepared to do and able to do with known technologies and changing our behaviours, systems and institutions to reduce our gross emissions, and how much are we willing to do through removals, which is largely today the planting of trees. And of course, the tree that gets planted most in the carbon game has been Pinus radiata. But that is not a permanent solution. The plant and pollute option is one the board of the Commission rejects. We need to be on a pathway that does not require an ever-increasing forest footprint in New Zealand, populated by Pinus radiata trees. So from New Zealand's point of view, there are natural timing and behavioural and technology constraints on what we can do between now and 2030 to reduce gross emissions and increase removals. The gap between what we can do through domestic action and our nationally determined contribution as it stands, or as it may be changed, is met by international mitigation. International mitigation is essentially paying someone else to do more than they would otherwise have committed to do. It's additional to the work that other country would have done. And it is important that one can validate the additionality of international mitigation so that you know you're getting what you paid for. There is no globally accepted traded carbon credit in the world today. That there are some bilateral arrangements, Switzerland and Peru, where the Swiss are able to satisfy themselves that the mitigation in Peru is meeting the additionality requirement. However, work needs to be done to create a robust, auditable, credible global mechanism for getting the most bang for our buck when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That work is unfinished work left over from the last Paris discussions.
Thank you, Rod. So here's a short and sharp question in from Saul Chambers. If you set targets and no one acts, then what?
Well, the way it will happen is that New Zealand is a signatory to the Paris Agreement. New Zealand is a small trading nation. We are utterly dependent on successful multilateralism to prosper in the world today. We have many treaties, defence treaties, trade treaties, and the Paris Agreement on climate change. As a multilateralist, New Zealand doesn't get to choose which treaties it complies with and which treaties it abandons. We believe in our obligations and we will meet our nationally determined contribution. So if we fail to take the domestic action that we can or should take, we will simply pay others who have been more willing and able to act. So it is New Zealand's choice about how we meet our nationally determined contribution, not whether we will meet it.
Thank you. Good answer. Here's another one from an anonymous. Do our budgets include the greenhouse gas emitted by tourists flying in and out of New Zealand? How can we or should we continue a large tourism industry given the need to reduce emissions?
Good and fair question. So at the Paris Agreement time, international aviation and international shipping were set aside for future determination because of the complexity of determining how to allocate those emissions. For example, with a flight, if it's a flight from Sydney, having originated in London, which country should carry that burden? Should it be the UK, because that's where the passenger originated? Should it be Australia, because that's where the last haul of the trip occurred? Those conversations have been being progressed in a multinational discourse with the airline industry to allocate responsibility for the greenhouse gases emitted from aviation. A similar process is underway for international shipping. Of course, what we need to do is not allocate these, we need to reduce them. So the real emphasis needs to go on low or no emitting fuels for flight and freight. And fortunately, such technologies are emerging. It's not clear what the winning technologies will be. It is pretty clear it's going to be more expensive to fly using safe aviation fuels than burning and emitting greenhouse gases from fossil fuels. It is probably, but not necessarily, the same with sea freight. But we are kidding ourselves if we think we can continue to fly around the world and ship goods around the world with the carbon footprint that those activities have. So New Zealand needs to contribute and will benefit from safe aviation fuel research and deployment. But you might find it cost more to fly to LA. So be it.
Thank you, Rod. We've got some really fantastic questions coming in, everyone. I'm just going to go through the list for a little bit longer so that we can get some more of those answered. If you have been putting them in the chat, can you please click on the Q&A and put them in the Q&A, because it's quite hard for me to see the chat and the Q&A at the same time. And I'm reading them out to Rod. Okay, so here's from Miriama Prickett. Is the Commission supporting the protection and enhancement of natural systems, native forests in particular, as a fundamental part of our response?
So let's just dwell a little on forestry for a moment. And the first thing is to say that the Commission, as a board of commissioners, has not landed its advice at this point. So be careful not to attribute what I say as this sort of final landing point. And we won't know that final landing point till we've put our advice out for consultation We've heard from all of you and many other stakeholders. We've reflected on that input and then finalised our advice. However, it would be fair to say that discussions around the Commission table and in the staff of the Commission, as I've already indicated, raise some concerns about the current trajectory where the economics drive planting pine trees rather than reducing gross emissions. The reason why planting pine trees is slightly problematic is that it is likely that climate change will have an adverse impact on the certainty with which carbon stored in pine forests will be held. Increasing risks of fire, storm, and disease in monocultures is a concern. Native trees may themselves also be adversely impacted by climate change. However, a diverse tapestry of indigenous trees in mixed type forests is likely to sequester carbon for the longer term with more certainty. As a consequence, the Commission is giving thought to what we would advise to ensure that while removals are a critical part of domestic action, that the removals create permanent sinks and that we get ourselves on a pathway that does not require an ever-expanding forest footprint. That afforestation, both exotic and native, offers time, but precious little of it, that will be squandered in the absence of decisive and bold action to reduce gross emissions. Native trees also, as has been hinted at, bring more than just carbon sequestration. They create a biodiversity which is critical to other indigenous life, particularly the bird life. They also create, for New Zealanders, a real sense of connection and belonging to a very special place on the planet. Work is being done by others on the appropriateness of biodiversity credits, which might sit alongside the carbon sequestration value of forests.
Thank you. That's a topic that gets a lot of discussion here at the Commission. And I think just to repeat what Rod said, we're having we're going to have a really good and open conversation here, but it's not necessarily what will be in the final advice. So thank you. Here's another one from an anonymous, which I think is a great question. How might you reconcile a desire to be a leader? So 95% of our listeners today said that they wanted to see Aotearoa be a leader in climate action, with the recognition that we're likely to face headwinds, 76%.
Good question.
Yeah.
I think New Zealanders typically do want to do the right thing, and that's represented by your attendance here today and clearly by the weight of vote. We want to do the right thing. But equally, we're kind of a pragmatic and realistic group of people. We're honest about our limitations. We are somewhat understated in our actions. And that doesn't surprise me that 3/4 of us would think this is going to be tough. We're not going to assume silver bullets or green cannonballs are going to bail us out. Our observation over the last 20 or 30 years is that New Zealanders have not been quick to change their behaviours in ways that may be inconvenient, have not been bold in supporting political leaders who take our climate action seriously. So I think that the way we do this is to set ambitious but realistic targets, that we describe pathways which are plausible and credible, anchored in our reality, evidence-based, data-rich, and that we coach and encourage each other to play our part in what will be heroic action. We can't leave it to others, but we need to change some of the institutional settings. And to do that, we need to reassure our political leaders that we are with them.
Thank you, Rod. Inspiring words there. Here's a question from Dennis Parker, another another COVID sort of question, which I think is a really good comparison. So as with COVID-19, much of the climate change debate is around the economy versus health. And for the Commission, emissions, and for climate change, emissions. Rather than producing a polarized outcome, will the Climate Change Commission be able to develop a policy position explaining how an emissions priority can lead to a positive economic outcome? I think we have covered this off a little bit, but
yes, I do think it's a false challenge. Unfortunately, the UK is a living example. This false challenge of you can either have a low emissions economy and be broke, or you can continue to prosper in a high emitting world. When you think about it, prospering in a high emitting world does not seem likely. The challenge for New Zealand is we will, in order to participate in a prosperous world, need to play our part in reducing our contribution to warming. But more importantly, if we're a laggard in this game, we are likely to find restrictions on our market access to the very markets that we need to have access to prosper. If we're a laggard, we are likely to find that the technologies and skills that we need to live in a low emissions future are not the skills and technologies which we have developed competency in. We don't necessarily have to be the first in the world, but being a fast follower, taking a position where we are willing to adopt new technologies and new ways of doing things, and do that confidently to build competence, is going to be incredibly important. The UK has reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by nearly 40% since 1990. And I know I can hear some saying, but they stopped burning coal and they had low-hanging fruit. But they made some bold choices about offshore wind. They made some bold choices about how they would decarbonize their industries. It's not all been plain sailing for them. And little understood is that the US has reduced its gross emissions in the order of 15% since 1990 as well. They have more work to do for sure, and per capita they emit more than we do. But I think we all need to find a pathway that shows that while there are costs in the transition, the state we get to is a brighter, cleaner, greener, healthier, and in the end, more sustainable and prosperous society.
Kia ora, Rod. Here's a question in from San Huggard from the Aotearoa Union. I think this is a good one because it starts to bring in some of that thinking that we're doing around equity and impacts. So kia ora, Rod. Mostly when we talk about just transition, it's been in respect of workers and communities in carbon exposed jobs like oil, gas and coal. But do you have thoughts also on how to ensure consumer-directed initiatives don't penalise those on very low incomes in the way petrol taxes and combustion engine car penalties may?
Very fair question. And in fact, part of what the Commission is obliged to do is analyse the impact of our advice, if it were taken, across a range of communities. So obviously around different deciles of income in our households, around between urban and rural communities, and the question inevitably of where will the burden fall for the cost of transition. That New Zealand has had access to some of the lowest cost motor vehicles on the planet through a set of policy choices. We don't have import taxes. Other policy choices, we're one of the only 3 countries in the world that don't have tailpipe emission standards. So we have essentially chosen to have a reasonably high emitting motor vehicle fleet at low capital cost, but relatively high operating cost. That's a configuration which wasn't an accident, was a series of choices. If we are now going to change that, and we are going to essentially increase the cost of commuting, because commuting at low emissions may be somewhat more costly than using the older fleet, we need to make sure that we, A, understand the impact of that on different communities, and offer advice how to mitigate that impact. And it may be that it is through some types of public transport build out, through some types of low cost or free access to public transport. It may be through targeted subsidies for those in certain circumstances who need support in accessing low emitting technologies. So there will be a range of ways in which particularly transport, but energy poverty in general is going to be an important issue. As we electrify, whether it's ground transport, heating our homes, and get away from high emitting fuels and energy sources, then ensuring that accessible, affordable electricity is part of New Zealand's social safety net becomes critically important. We want households to make good choices, but in some cases, those choices are severely constrained by the circumstances, the physical location, the household budget, knowledge and understanding, or institutional arrangements, which have caused people to live distance from their work or education. And not always is our public transport going to fill in that gap because of the density of population, the urban spread that we have allowed and encouraged over the last 50 years. So we need, as New Zealanders, to understand that we're only going to make this journey if we carry with us the people most vulnerable, most likely to be disadvantaged in the transition. Otherwise, they will have no incentive to support or play their part. And that will be to the detriment of us all.
Kia ora, Ron. Thank you. I have a question now in from Anna Rose Solomon Banks, which has had a shout out from somebody else as well who wants to see it answered. Anna asks, what does the direction of policy with the Commission's advice look like to engage Māori Te Tiriti, the treaty, adopted policies? How? Who is accountable? Is there a process to implement this? In local government, as public servants, how can we leverage our mātauranga Māori and marae education and or opportunities for education in a changing climate?
Huge agenda topic. So the first thing is that we have a number of members of our staff in the Commission who have deep personal iwi connections, and we've been using those connections to build case study around climate impact, climate action. But more importantly, they have acted to help all of the Commission staff understand the Te Ao Māori perspective on all our work. So there will be some identified work specifically about the topics and issues that you are raising. But to me, the principal part of the contribution Te Ao Māori makes is through a worldview that should inform all of the work of the Commission. And let me give you a couple of examples. My background in academic training is as a classical economics student and graduate, where markets are seen as some sort of altar on which many things can be sacrificed for the good of all. The reality is that anybody who believes in markets and the power of markets also understands concepts such as market failure and externalities. These have been understood for hundreds of years, ever since the birth of the study of markets and economics. It was interesting, a Māori gentleman explained to me why he could talk my language about externalities, those things which are left over or out of the market. But in Te Ao Māori, there's no concept of an externality because everything is included and connected. The past, the present, the future. There's no concept that there's me different from you. It's us, and we're all connected. So he was able in that moment to share by his understanding of my upbringing a perspective which I think is incredibly important to how we think about climate action. That inevitably our way of doing science deconstructs things and reduces things to manageable bits. But when you tear a machine apart into its manageable bits, you lose something. That configuration of parts that creates the engine is our society. And there is a risk in the deconstruction that we lose sight of the purpose of it all. And I think that's where we Maori, can learn so much through a Maori culture, not as a parallel culture, but as an integral part of what makes New Zealand distinctive. And by the way, Indigenous cultures around the world have the ability to make that contribution, because they have, of necessity over the ages, been much more integrative in their knowledge frameworks than we have become in our industrialized Western way of doing science and thinking about how we define problems and their solutions.
Kia ora, thank you, Rod. That's great timing. I'd love to keep going with these questions. They're really fantastic. This has been a very good discussion. We've only got 4 minutes left, so I think maybe we'll use it as an opportunity to wrap up before we launch into anything else. We will look at everything that you've submitted. We're going to put up our last poll, which please don't, this is just a fun, well, kind of fun, and also things to show you how some of the things that we're thinking about, but the ways we're thinking, I guess. And then please give us some feedback, and we'll look at doing a couple of more of these between now and February. We have more of our commissioners available to speak. I think we've got one on the 9th of December. And yeah, basically have a wonderful afternoon. Kia ora, everybody. Thank you, Rod.
Kia ora, everybody, and I do appreciate all of your time and your support, and genuinely the passion that many of you bring to this extremely challenging and important work.
And if you haven't signed up to our newsletter, please do, because that will tell you when we have these sessions on and what's going on at the Commission and what other information we're going to be providing to you. And Bevan, can you send us off, please?
Kia ora, tēnā koutou mua koutou awhina I tukua mai, hei tautoko I tā tātou hui, me te kaupapa nei. Thank you all for your contributions to this wānanga. Ko tāku mahi anai nei, he karakia mutunga. Kia tātou katoa. Te ata whai o tō tātou āriki a ihu karaiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga o te wairua tapu, ake, amini.
Amini.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.